During that memorable meeting with journalists when Azerbaijani President Ilham Aliyev advised Ukrainians never to agree to the occupation of their territories, he also accepted military patches from Ukrainian journalist Olena Kurbanova, and he wished her success in her future work. This gesture alone has already provoked outrage among Russian propagandists. It's not enough for them that Aliyev speaks openly about the occupation of Ukrainian territory, or that he's suing Russia, which still refused to provide the results of its investigation into the destruction by its air defense system of an Azerbaijani passenger plane. Now he's also accepting patches from the Ukrainian armed forces. But we all understand perfectly well that such statements from Russian propagandists and their calls to punish Azerbaijan stem primarily from frustration. Baku is now speaking to Moscow with the tone of an independent state, not a renamed Soviet republic. And this is precisely what irritates the leadership of the Russian Federation and Russian propagandists the most. Something similar once happened with the Baltic states, and then came perhaps the Kremlin's most painful experience with Ukraine, when Ukrainian leaders began speaking to the Russian counterparts in the language of directives that were to be delivered to the Russian officials as one state to the other. When Ukrainian presidents and prime ministers began discussing bilateral relationship with Russia instead of Ukraine's integration into Russia-led structures that Moscow kept trying to impose on us at every step. When Ukraine announced its own foreign policy path and its inspiration to join the European Union, at the time NATO wasn't even part of the conversation, and all this caused irritation in Russia, bordering on hysteria. That was when, in Putin's Russia, plans began to form to replace Ukrainian leadership with a predictable puppet government, one that would fulfill the Kremlin's every wish. That was when the annexations and occupations of Ukrainian territory began, culminating in a full-scale war with a neighboring state that had recently been portrayed in Russian propaganda as a brotherly nation and Russia's closest ally. It all comes down to arrogance and a sense of superiority, which I would argue defines not only Russian foreign policy but also the national philosophy itself. And now we are seeing something similar happening with Azerbaijan. Azerbaijani living in Russia and Azerbaijan as a whole have always been portrayed in Russian media comically, with a kind of patronizing mockery, laced with the ever-present implication: we know you are not on our level, but we are willing to speak to you graciously. And if you do something we don't approve of, your job is to stay silent and never express your opinion. And yet, there is nothing illogical about Azerbaijan's foreign policy stance on Russia's occupation on Ukrainian land. If Azerbaijan were to condone the occupation of foreign territories in the post-Soviet space, how would Baku then explain the restoration of its own territorial integrity, especially by military means? There is nothing illogical either in the Azerbaijani president demanding an apology for the destruction of an Azerbaijani passenger aircraft. After all, the head of any state is expected to defend his own citizens and his national airline. Acknowledging responsibility for the unintentional downing of a civilian aircraft isn't shameful. It isn't humiliating. What's most astonishing is that Moscow has never seen it that way. Not during Soviet times when a Korean Airlines passenger jet was shot down. Not when a Malaysian passenger plane was destroyed by a Russian missile over occupied Donbass. And not now when it comes to the Azerbaijani aircraft. These are fundamentally opposite worldviews, where international law and basic human decency demand respect, Moscow sees only an opportunity for contempt. To prove its superiority of neighboring countries, Russia must place itself above international law, above humanity, above respect for the sovereignty of other nations. And it is obvious that a state like this can only produce and provoke conflicts with the countries around it. And the same goes for the military patches. Yes, President Aliyev made a calculated diplomatic gesture of politeness. But what did Russian propagandists want? For him to push away the journalist offering him a gift? Of course, nothing like that happened at the meeting with journalists and couldn't have happened. But we know what Moscow would like. That Ukrainian journalists not be invited to meetings with Azerbaijani's leadership at all. That it would be Moscow who decides whom Ilham Aliyev should or shouldn't meet. That Moscow also decides who Armenian Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan meets with. That it draw up the guest list for every leader of every former Soviet republic. They want the leaders of those republics to understand which holidays they are permitted to celebrate and which ones they should avoid, just to avoid upsetting Moscow. And this is not a joke. We remember how furious Moscow became when Ukraine began commemorating the victims of the Holodomor, an artificial famine orchestrated by the Soviet communist regime. And we see how in recent years Kazakhstan has tried to downplay the Great Famine in its own history so as not to provoke the Russian leadership. But this is no way to conduct relations between sovereign states. Sooner or later, Russia will have to come to terms with the fact that the countries around it are not limited sovereignty states whose lives are governed by rules written in Moscow. Thank you for watching, have a nice day, and Slava Ukraini!